Now, imagine if you couldn't see or hear. According to Able Australia, deafblindness is a condition that currently affects nearly 300,000 people and has become Australia's forgotten disability. Joining us in the studio is the CEO of Able Australia, Celestine Hare. Celestine Hare, thank you for your time this morning.
Pleasure.
And joining us this morning also is Michelle Stevens, who's affected by deafblindness. And as Michelle can't see or hear, her interpreter Dennis Whitcomb is here this morning as well, and he'll relay our questions to Michelle using tactile sign language. Michelle and Dennis, good morning and welcome to you both. Dennis, if I can ask you to ask Michelle, we know that people are deaf, we know that people are blind, but does she feel that having the two conditions makes her condition particularly overlooked and not recognised by people?
Yeah, that actually is true. I think when you think of, a lot of people think of blindness, fine, they see me as a person who is blind because I use a guide dog. And they may see people who are deaf and they recognise deafness. When you ask the average person whether about deafblindness, I think immediately people think of Helen Keller.
Yes.
And a lot of people do not recognise that there are people that have a dual sensory disability of deafblindness and the unique challenges that a person like myself is faced. For instance, I was born blind and have grew up in the blind community and blind culture, but I lost my hearing as a near-fatal disease. I lost the remaining of my hearing because I had severe ear infections right throughout as a young child. So about 17 years ago, I became profound deaf.
And Celestine Hare, how forgotten is this disability from your point of view?
I think there's been a view that the numbers are very low, and that's been a difficulty for us and probably prompted the reason behind us inviting Access Economics to do this research report for us. And I think the astounding part of it all is that the figures are much, much larger than any of us ever envisaged. And I think this is the message that we really need to send to the community and to government, that with 300,000 people currently deafblind in Australia, it is going, and growing, I might say. So by the year 2050, it's projected to be in excess of 1.1 million.
And how big is the funding gap between those number of people who are deafblind and what governments are currently putting on the table to help the people out?
Well, currently we're funded to provide services to people up to 65, and we provide about 3 hours per week, which is certainly not enough by anyone's means. I mean, if you can imagine, if you can't hear and you can't see, you really need 24/7 support, and 3 hours a week just goes absolutely nowhere. So funding is a major issue for us, or the lack of.
Michelle Stevens, what do you need in your life? What do you feel needs to be provided to make your life a little easier?
Okay, I live in the country. I live in Traralgon, which is approximately about 133 k's from Melbourne. And in Traralgon, there's only very, very few people who have the suitable qualifications to support. I receive about 2 hours a week support from a sensory support worker. That enables me to go shopping, link with the community. The reason why I think of our support workers as a sensory support worker, because they're our eyes and ears to the community.
Yes.
And I think it's really important, as Celestine said, that we really need a lot more support from government to increase the amount of support that deafblind people have. I'm fortunate, and I consider myself to be very lucky to receive what I do, but however, speaking to the deafblind community, we really do not receive enough support from the government to increase these hours.
And finally, Celestine Hare, how can Australians, how can people perhaps watching this program express their support for what you're trying to achieve during Deafblind Awareness Week?
Well, if people would like to tap into our website, which is www.ableaustralia.org.au, or phone us on 1300 225 369, and there'll be somebody very willing to take the calls if they'd like to call us.
Celestine Hare, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Mark.
And Michelle Stephens and Dennis Whitcomb, and also the guide dog Logan, which I don't think you can see, who's lying down on the floor this morning. Thank you to all of you for coming in this morning too. Thanks so much.
Well, it's obviously difficult for people to cope with being blind or being deaf, but a surprisingly large number of Australians are suffering from both disabilities.
Able Australia says deaf blindness currently affects more than 250,000 of us, and that number is expected to grow. Deaf Blindness Awareness Week starts tomorrow. Joining us now is Celestine Hare, CEO of Able Australia. Thank you very much for joining us.
A pleasure.
Tell us about the incidence of deaf blindness.
The incidence of deaf blindness is significant, and it currently is really the underestimated and disability that is the quiet disability, because there's been very little awareness about how significant it is. And as we see from the Access Economics report produced some 12 months ago for us, they're estimating that 288,000 people in Australia currently have deaf blindness.
Can I just jump in there? In this day and age of medical technology, why is it on the rise?
The ageing population, we're living longer, we're eating much better than we did in the past, we're looking after our well-being, and of course, as we age, the growing population, it's a massive problem for the future.
Someone that can't see or hear, I mean, everyday activities, things that we take for granted, must pose just an incredible challenge.
Enormously difficult for them. And as you can imagine, isolation is a major factor which causes depression, all sorts of added on difficulties, people who have vision and hearing loss, which of course becomes a taxpayer issue, because those 288,000 people currently costing taxpayers $7 billion. And Access are suggesting that by 2050 there'll be well in excess of 1 million people with deaf blindness. Frightening stats.
Indeed it is. This is your big week, of course. What have you got planned for the week? What do you hope to achieve with it?
We're doing a number of radio interviews around Australia and television appearances, which is just fantastic for the exposure. And we really need to get out and convince government of the huge difficulty there is for now and in the future. So
for anyone who's interested, how can they find out more information or perhaps find out how to help?
If they visit our website on www.ableaustralia.org.au, or simply just give us a call on 1300 225 369.
Are you attempting to target younger people here, given that it's an ageing disease? Is it important for younger people to understand what's going on?
Oh, very much so, yes. And I think this is where the medical profession can really be very helpful, in that if they detect, even at birth, that there is some hearing or vision loss or a combination of both, if they then refer them through to the correct channels, which are organisations like ours, it helps enormously both parents and the person with the disability. So,
Celestine, thank you very much indeed. We hope the week goes well for you.
Thank you so much.
And that you do create some awareness. Hope we've helped a little bit this morning too.
Indeed you have. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for your time.
It's 17-2. We talked about first days and starts. What if you were born, okay, and you start your life and you are vision impaired? And so you learn as you age to deal with that. But you also grow up with chronic ear problems. Those ear problems become progressively worse. And eventually you're clinically deaf, clinically blind. You are now one of a group who Able Australia wishes us to highlight. The CEO of Able Australia is here, Celestine Hare. Welcome, Celestine.
Thank you, Richard.
Sorry, there you are. Now try again. Welcome, Celestine.
Thank you, Richard.
Also, I have two other people before me, one of whom is the person I just described. Michelle Stephens was born vision impaired and grew up with chronic ear problems that became progressively worse. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Hello, Richard. It's really, really nice to be here. Thank you.
And Michelle is able to hear my conversation because sitting with her is Eliza. And Eliza, let's try to describe what are you feeling and hearing, Michelle?
As you're talking, I can feel Eliza's signs. I can't hear conversations well enough in this formal sort of setting. However, on a one-to-one, if I know the person really, really well, I can understand some of the conversation. However, when using a tactile Auslan interpreter, which is a method of communication I use, I put my hands over the interpreter's hands and she starts signing. Now, there are a few differences in signing where space is reduced. Some signs are changed slightly so that I can feel the signs. So tactile Auslan is one means of how a deafblind person communicates. Another mean is where a person will fingerspell into my hand. That's another way of communication. If I'm at a shop and I need someone to tell me, let's say, if it costs $10 and I can't hear what they're saying, the person will write in my palm, 10, so I know it costs $10.
That's just an amazing degree of tactile nature. The spelling is tapping with your fingertips on the palm of the hand, and Eliza literally is doing a form of sign language now with Michelle's hands just on the outside, just lightly touching the outside, getting the shape of the hand signs. And yet she's so clever, she is able to follow that conversation just as if she heard it.
It takes a lot of work and a lot of practice.
It's just amazing. Celestine, how did you become involved with Able Australia?
I joined Able Australia, formerly the Deafblind Association, Richard, 22 years ago. So I became involved as the accountant at the time, and things were very different then. We were doing things manually. So you can just imagine the changes that have taken place over 22 years. They've been significant. And at the time we had one computer and one receptionist. To the stage now we've grown, we are interstate, and we're providing support to many, many people. We deal also with people with multiple disabilities.
How many people roughly have dual disabilities in deafblindness in Australia?
Access Economics' most recent report tells us there's 288,000 people nationally with deafblindness. And if your listeners know the MCG, which has a capacity of around 100,000, you'd be very aware that that's almost 3 times the capacity. So very large number, costing the taxpayers in excess of $7 billion per annum.
From all causes, illness, birth defect, is there any common cause for these things, or are they all those spectrums?
Look, there's a number of causes, Richard. The most significant, back in the late 60s, we had an epidemic which was the congenital rubella syndrome, and that caused a lot of the babies born during that time whose mums had this syndrome, they were born deaf-blind, and most of them had intellectual disabilities. But fortunately, with the vaccination programs that we have now, the MMR, measles, mumps and rubella, that has reduced the number significantly.
Interesting, isn't it? People, I guess, who don't work in your area forget why those immunisations were brought in.
Yes, this is true. But of course, now with the population growing from people overseas, there are significant risks because they don't have such programs in various countries. And of course, various communities now are not vaccinated against this syndrome. So,
Michelle, when did you start learning how to sign in the way you are now, how to read signs in the way you are now?
Okay, I have been signing for just over 12 years now. I was born hearing, and in actual fact, Auslan is not my first language. Auslan is my second language, although primarily I do majority of my communication through sign language. I completed a graduate diploma at La Trobe University in graduate diploma deaf studies and languages, and I believe I'm the first deafblind person ever to finish a graduate diploma at La Trobe University. It's taken 3 to 5 years really working very hard. The reason why I studied at La Trobe Auslan is that I needed to learn about the linguistics, and I do enjoy going in depth learning about things, and I'm actually into my final year of my Bachelor of Arts degree at La Trobe, studying English and history. Particularly, I have a love for British history, so sign language has really helped to open up the community for me. For instance, if I didn't have a fully qualified ASLIA, Australian Sign Language Interpreter, accredited person to sign for me at La Trobe, or any formal setting, I wouldn't be able to do the studying and go to lectures as I do today. As Able Australia provides professional support workers, enabling us to access the community just like any other person.
If you had trouble getting out of bed this morning because it was cold and you had to go to work and you didn't want to, or you had to do the chores for today and you didn't want to, you didn't feel like it, I want you to take a deep breath and think about Michelle. Michelle, I'm really surprised. You seem, just in the little time we've met each other, to be cheerful, radiating happiness. And I did expect someone who was more under the surface fearful. I would understand if you were always uncertain and always a little bit afraid. What's your world like? How do you feel generally?
I think it's really important to recognise that, okay, when I first became profoundly deaf due to an illness, I had a illness in my ears called cholesteatoma, and I had to have several operations. The cholesteatoma was the final straw that, let's say, broke the camel's back as far as my hearing was concerned. As a person, I was a full-time professional musician at the time, travelling around playing piano and organ, etc. And it was really difficult because not only had my own personal life changed, but also my career, my professional career just fell out, the bottom just fell out overnight when I no longer could hear music. And at first I was very fearful, but through professional case management that Able Australia provided to me, I actually have been able to, let's say, pick up the pieces. Sure, there are days when I have my good days. There are times when I'm not as, let's say, forthgoing because there may be other problems. But usually, as you see, Richard, is basically what you get, because I really think that it's very important to get the most out of life. You know, if someone says to me, I have to do 100%, I actually do 110%, just to get that little bit more out of out of life.
Michelle, I've got an SMS for you. Thank you, Richard, for raising some awareness. I'm so happy to hear Michelle on the radio. Please say hello to her from me. My sign name is AA in capitals. Keep up the good work. Support Deafblind to Able Australia. Smiling, that's Ainsley and Seaford. I'm struck as I'm chatting and just in awe of Michelle's bravery. Celestine, the enormous amount of important work your organisation does. It's not abstract. It is, you have definite, you can measure your KPIs. You have to train and educate, teach people a new language, enable them to have confidence to walk outside a room if they're deaf-blind or if whichever of the disabilities. Incredible work. Who volunteers? Who works with you?
We have we work with a number of other sensory agencies, Richard, but we have some very well trained professional staff, and this was a great benefit to us because they were so well trained that when government policy changed, whereby we had to move from a specialist deaf-blind agency. We were virtually a boutique agency, and we had to extend those skills to move into providing other areas or support for other people with disabilities. So I would have to say, but of course our deaf-blind staff are particularly trained in how to support a deaf-blind person. That's with mobility, with touch, how to guide them, and making sure that whenever a person who is deaf-blind is approached, that you introduce yourself, you make sure that the deaf-blind person is aware why you're there, you explain what you're going to do. You might be escorting them to have coffee. You might be taking them to pay the bills. So all of this sort of training is really quite intense for our staff.
Let's talk to Eliza for a moment. Stay where you are, Eliza, and keep signing to Michelle. And I'm going to push this towards you. No, you're shaking your head. I read that sign. Where did you train?
Oh, sorry, Richard, I wasn't prepared for this. I trained at RMIT University in Melbourne.
Keep signing to Michelle so she can follow the conversation. What made you want to do what you're doing?
I think for like most interpreters, they have a passion for signing. Am I right? They have a passion for signing, and also, like I know, like Eliza and many other interpreters, particularly being a interpreter for deafblind people, you have to provide that little bit extra special in interpreting. That is, not all interpreters like a tactile, because you have to sort of get fairly close into a person.
Mm-hmm.
So not everyone actually is comfortable with that, particularly at conferences or meetings, etc., where we have to sit, let's say, fairly close.
Within a foot or so of each other, yeah.
Tactile. So not everyone is that comfortable with that. And certainly interpreters don't do it for the money, because, they certainly, a lot of interpreters do it for, because they want a basic help. Some may come from a background of having a deaf mother and father. Some may have a brother or a sister or sibling who is deaf. So really, that's how many interpreters become interpreters.
All of that is fascinating. You just heard Michelle, who's deaf and blind, answer for Eliza, who is neither of those things, but is the touch sign interpreter. And what it says to me, Eliza looked completely shocked when I went to speak to her. And what it reminded me of is when there's a guide dog also at Michelle's feet. It's a bit like when you go to pat the guide dog and someone says, no, the dog's working. Eliza is working. Her full concentration is on everything to connect with Michelle and explain to Michelle. And the idea that she would speak individually, you could see just, no, that's not what her training is. That is not who she is. She's all about supporting Michelle. It's a fascinating relationship, and both Eliza and Michelle are smiling at each other as they're signing.
I think it's important, Richard, to that when we are working with a person who's deafblind, is you've got to have that sort of rapport with someone. As you said before, is someone sort of miserable or perhaps a bit sort of not a outgoing, happy person, that can make communication that much more difficult. And it takes a very special person who Able Australia trains to become support workers. So I just wondered if I may cover a little bit of some of the work that a support worker does for us. For instance, I live in Traralgon, so I actually have a support worker 2 hours a week, so it may perhaps help to access a community banking, shopping. A few months ago, I wanted to buy a new mattress, although yes, I could do it myself, and having a pen and paper or perhaps take my braille computer so that I could communicate. But my support worker just makes it much easier to access the community just like any other person. They're trained, as Celestine said before, in guiding. They're also trained in just making life that little bit easier. It's true that the dual sensory disability of deafblindness at times takes a lot of concentration, and sometimes in the evening, fatigue, tiredness is certainly an issue for many people. So it'll be interesting if we met at 10 o'clock, perhaps 11 o'clock in the evening, see whether I'll be as bright.
I can only imagine the incredible effort. I want you to think about your day, and I want you to think about the things that are stressing yourself, and then I want you to think about Michelle and suck it up. Celestine and Michelle, thank you so much. Eliza, you're not looking at me, but thank you as well for showing me a world that exists as I forget and just go about my daily things. You're both incredible people in what you do. I can't imagine the bravery it takes to walk out your front door, Michelle. Thank you so much. If you'd like to find out more, you can go to ableaustralia.org.au.